Good evening and welcome to the McLuhan Institute Live, number 27, McLuhan Letters. I am back on my regular Tuesday evening. It's just past 9 p.m. And this has been an experiment. Last week we had some technical difficulties and I only ended up with 8 or so minutes in which we took a brief look at the McLuhan shelves behind me here, which I have just started to inventory, and that's very exciting, and next week we'll share some of that. I realized after the fact that last week, episode 26, I missed an opportunity, 26 letters of the alphabet, to discuss not the alphabet but letters. And one of the things we have here at the McLuhan Institute, along with our McLuhan family archives of Marshall and Eric McLuhan, is a considerable amount of Corinne McLuhan's archive. And that includes these boxes of letters. And they're personal letters, and mostly letters between Marshall and Corinne McLuhan. Corinne Keller-Lewis for some of the time, and also some earlier letters of Corinne's from before she met Marshall. And it's a fascinating correspondence, which I've only briefly, as with so many things in this building, I've only just scratched the surface of them because there's so much to look at. And I don't think anybody has really looked at these materials. I don't think anyone who's written a biography to do with Marshall has had access to them. And maybe I'll get a bit of flack for looking at them now, but I'm just going to go for it because, enough time has passed and there's some fascinating stuff in here, which I'm going to share with you today, follower of the McLuhan Institute on Facebook, where I'm doing this live broadcast. Or if you're following me right now on the YouTube channel, hello, and please follow me on the Facebook, the Instagram, the Twitter as well. I picked out 3 letters to look at, and they'll really speak for themselves. So I'm going to start with one from Corinne Lewis, 602 West 2nd Street, Fort Worth, Texas, to Marshall McLuhan, Mr. Marshall McLuhan, 4343 McPherson, St. Louis, Missouri. And the stamp is Fort Worth, January 13th, 10:30 a.m., Texas, 1939. I picked at this and the next letter because they're very close to each other. This one's January 13th. This letter is January 22nd, 1939, 10 p.m. To Miss Corinne Lewis, 602 West 2nd, Fort Worth, Texas, from Marshall in St. Louis. I'm pretty sure there must have been letters in between, and I didn't dig deep enough to find the immediate predecessor to this letter, which will be important to look at eventually, because you will see. So they're a week apart, January 13th, January 22nd, but I wanted to show those two because they're so very close in date. And this third one is from July 16th, 1940, addressed to Mrs. Herbert Marshall McLuhan, 602 West 2nd Street, Fort Worth, Texas, from Marshall in St. Louis. So in the time in between, in the year and a half, Marshall and Corinne were married. But these 2 letters are from before, a bat just flew by my window, are from before Marshall and Corinne were married. And I don't think people have much of an idea of what that was like, so I want to share this with you. Corinne, I'm not as familiar with Corinne McLuhan's handwriting, so I may fumble over a few things. And she also writes with a very sort of southern sort of language. So she addresses it, howdy thar, T-H-A-R, exclamation mark. She's very full of life. Thursday, howdy thar. I shan't even refer to your letter of Saturday evening après ballet. There's about 10 exclamation marks there. Thank you for the ballet program. We don't present it until Friday the 20th. Program unannounced as yet. Only one performance. I should also say, at this time, Corinne McLuhan is at the Pasadena Playhouse, I believe, in Pasadena, where she met Marshall's mother, Elsie Naomi Hall, and it's Elsie who introduced Marshall and Corinne, who got them together. I don't know the exact date offhand, but Marshall and Corinne are a couple at this point, quite. Just in from choir practice, a wet, drizzly, cold evening, plumped down on a footstool in front of the fire, toasting my toes, your most recent letters strewn about me, magnificently domestic view, deceptive appearance. I think this is Gerline, G-I-R-L-E-N-E. Gerline just called. She was quite pleased with your note, which she had just received. Enjoyed being with you very much, etc., etc. It will be heavenly if you can drive down with your father. How long might you be here? I should be in school, you know, until 3:30, barring special, quote, meeting and, quote, conferences, etc. When would you drive? I know I shall adore your father if your description is accurate. Well, unbiased. If your description is accurate, well, unbiased. Did I dodge low enough there? 2/3 through 1919. Now at last that I'm accustomed to, quote, camera eye and, quote, newsreel, I find them indispensable, giving the fanciful touch of reality to the writing. I'm enjoying the book, no end. At first, camera eye distracted and disconcerted my attention by its seeming irrelevancy, lack of punctuation. 2. It does add immeasurably to the general mood, background, environment of the tale, like his practice of developing isolated characters, later knitting them together in his something. Know anything about Passos? Glad to receive the explanations of his sex motif. Of course I am not, quote, equal to you, quote, in experience, not having, quote, been around. I should think you would rejoice in that fact. It is a source of some pride to me. It strikes me that we both have a thick, inflexible epidermis, like pride innate, and built up consciously both. Well, after all, my good resolution Sunday concerning an extended bit of exercise, Texas clouds bumped their heads together and began to weep copiously, to the delight of the farmers. So much for good intentions, Medea. I challenge your contention of writing more in 4.5 minutes. You simply write larger. Haven't vocalized sweet mystery of life yet. However, I may have to for a quick tea one of these days. How the dear old ladies ooh and ah over it always. What a life! Fencing tomorrow night. Then later in the evening I have to put an appearance at a something dance, formal. How I dread it. Another teachers' meeting tomorrow. English, something representatives this time. Makes 4 this week. Several sessions to hear a Miss Johnson take on technique of teaching reading. Monotonous voice, colorless individual, high in her own estimation, no new ideas, repetition of old ones, nothing stimulating or constructive. Yet she was paid $250 for her 3 days talk here. What a graft! All of us, except the bigwigs, were disgusted at our loss of time. Lots to do, piles of themes, and already 11 o'clock, so a hurried good night, my dear love, Corinne. Sorry, I cannot replicate her southern accent at all, and I won't try. But try and imagine Corinne was the epitome of a southern belle. Quite a graceful lady, very cultured. We're going to go over this week, but that's okay because this is important stuff. Dave, hey Dave, thank you. Been around, yeah. Not very subtle. So here is Marshall's 14-page reply. Dave, I've got some mail I've got to put together for you. I'll do it before I head out. This is a remarkable letter. This should probably be published. And I don't know who has ever seen it, so maybe you're the first. Sunday afternoon. Another time you may relax, darling. You can write such gratifying letters when in a weakened, fatigued state. Stay that way. However, you are probably repenting the foible by now. I want to know what that was about. You ask, by the way, whether I go to daily mass. No. But really, during vacation, it does seem the least that one can do. You see, to hear Mass and to receive communion are spiritual acts, not merely acts of worship, but acts which have definite, specific merit. This merit can be applied to any other person, either on earth or in purgatory. If you're not interested in Marshall's views on specifically Catholicism and Christianity, tune out now, because it's 14 pages of it. I'm going to read it anyway. I have a captive audience. The merit can be applied to any other person, either on earth or in purgatory. The merit of these acts does not, and this is crucial, proceed from the person performing the act, since human merits, all of them, in their entirety from the beginning of history, are not sufficient to compensate for the tiniest sin. For even the tiniest sin constitutes an act of spiritual rebellion against God. The tiniest imaginable sin is thus infinite in its enormity, since it is a sin against an infinitely good, the only absolute being. Thus, the merit, to return to the point of spiritual acts, is derivative. It is derived from Christ. The infinite merit of his incarnation, his infinitely humbling himself, was alone sufficient to, quote, liquidate all human sins for all time. But the subsequent acts of his life have a mysterious value. A mystery is, strictly, not something queer or hidden, but something unfathomably and inexhaustibly rich in meanings, which naturally, in their very nature, dwarf every historical event and every philosophical or scientific truth. This is really heavy stuff. Marshall was a recent convert to Catholicism at this point, and he's laying it out to Corinne. So I'm going to Mass and assisting at that bloodless sacrifice. So in going to Mass and assisting at that bloodless sacrifice, one is simply applying the merits of Christ either to oneself or, as the phrase goes, to one's friends and benefactors, known or unknown. And nothing could be more natural when it is realized that the Church is strictly a society, though supernatural in character. Let me point out some immediately obvious conclusions or implications attaching even to the brief suggestions here. First, since all sin is infinitely horrible and insulting to God, we are dependent creatures owing our entire being to him. Catholics are taught and generally recognize that one man is quite as great a sinner as the next, knowing himself to be essentially imperfect, and he readily conceives charity for the imperfections of others. But charity for the sinner is quite compatible with intense repulsion from the sin. Moreover, he realizes that any moral virtue which he or anybody may achieve is directly owing to the mercy of God and the merits of Christ. He knows that he can take no credit for any goodness he achieves, and in reverencing the saints and relics associated with them, the Catholic is venerating the signs of God's favor toward a creature. Another important Catholic attitude follows. There is no sense of strain such as arises in Calvinistic quarters where the means of grace are denied, and either a deliberate effort of the will to believe is insisted on, or else mere predestination is taught. He's a little hard on Protestants in this letter, but he was a Protestant himself before this. More important than any other single difference between Catholic attitudes and others is perhaps that the Catholic does not, quote, fear God, but has every reason to love him. The first thoughts which a Catholic has of God and that which a man has for a real friend. It is only his second thought which may suggest to him how little he deserves such friendship. Taking this fact together with the social nature of the Church, it is easy to see why Catholics speak so freely and naturally of their prayers and devotions. There is nothing proper to human nature which is not perfected and assisted by the Church. Every human faculty finds its true use and function only within the Church. That is hard for Protestants to realize, because religion with them is so commonly a matter of restrictions and prohibitions. The Church, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with action, since potency can only become real through act. The Protestant has or had a half-truth. He starves on a half-loaf, forgoing his rightful heritage, much as the paranoiac imagines his dinner to be poisoned. I told you this was heavy. And this brings up a dozen other matters. One doesn't take the Protestant errors very seriously after one has looked into a dozen or so similar heresies which sprang up in the 3rd and 4th centuries. There were heresies before the 3rd as well as after. And to understand orthodoxy, some study of the history of the Church is necessary. Orthodoxy is intellectual honesty as regards divine things. Heresy is intellectual and spiritual lying to God himself. It is thus the most hateful of all sins, the one most bitterly punished by an orthodox state or polity. But there are no longer any orthodox states. This makes it difficult for us to sympathize with historical times when heresy was persecuted. Now, a man like Luther was a heretic. This is Marshall from 1939, people. He lied to God. He knew the truth, but subsequent Lutherans, etc., were never told the truth, and they were denied the sacraments which led to an inferior awareness of the truth. Thus, it requires some considerable, quote, luck or effort on the part of a Protestant today to rediscover orthodoxy. That is why most converts tend to be intellectuals, people with special knowledge of history and philosophy. It is true, for example, that a majority of Protestant ministers, even non-Anglican, in America today are intellectually convinced of the claims of the Catholic Church. But one can readily appreciate their practical obstacles to becoming Catholics. Furthermore, it is possible to be intellectually convinced and yet to have no spiritual grace or motive to assist one. The latter, in such instances, is lacking simply because the person refuses to pray or to ask for it. And that's an important part that Marshall actually brings up a lot, that he became a convert through prayer. I think he said somewhere that, or maybe it was my dad, that you can always tell someone who's drifting away from the church because they've stopped praying. To return to the poisoned food of the paranoiac, I refer, of course, to the Eucharist. Luther used to fall in a fit when celebrating the Mass. He was terrified by the actual presence of God, owing to his really terrible defection from God. But, perhaps oddly, heresy never begins by attacking dogma. At the time of the Reformation, nobody ever denied the reality of God's presence in the Mass, at first. The Reformers lied in their hearts, but they pretended to be concerned only with the correction of abuses within the Church. Gradually, by appealing to the cupidity of kings and princes, they produced schisms, and schisms, such as the Anglican, were soon widened by heresy. But note, the heresies were imposed from the top. The vast majority of Englishmen were as horrified as they were helpless when the Mass was abolished. There were at least 5 serious but badly organized revolts. But in the meantime, the aristocracy was bought off by the enormous bribes of monastic lords, and the English people were deprived of the sacraments. At first they thought it would be only for a few years. ... Human weakness accomplished the rest. Today England is returning to the faith. I just read a most interesting book by Clara Longworth, Countess de Chambrun, Shakespeare Rediscovered. She produces an enormous amount of evidence to show how all of Shakespeare's friends were Catholics, from Richard Field, his printer, to the Earl of Southampton and Essex, his patrons. Even his friend Whitgift, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a profound Catholic sympathizer. Of course, it has long been known that his father and mother were staunch Catholics, and that his father was ruined, as were the rest of English Catholics, by the enormous fines imposed for non-attendance at Anglican services. Shakespeare himself had to pay about $2,000 in our money to the local Anglican bishop for the privilege of being married by a priest. He was finally driven to London by the persecutions of Sir Thomas Lucy, of, quote, humorous fame. Lucy was one of the most prominent harriers of Catholics of the day. I merely mention this as an instance of the complete and sordid silence which official English history has imposed on all these long-known facts. You speak, Corinne, of the suffering for your present need. You speak, Corinne, of the sufficiency of your present needs, of your present beliefs. I fully understand that. As I mentioned, I felt no need of Catholic dogma or belief, even after I was received into the Church. If ever there was a self-sufficient mind or person, and of course there never can be such since we are created beings, it was I. But I came to know so much about orthodoxy that it was impossible to retain my intellectual integrity any longer except by acting. I saw quite clearly that my only alternative was atheism, active hatred of the Church. For, after a certain point one either moves rapidly toward the Church or equally rapidly away from it. I don't think it is unfair of me to talk about these things to you, but I must say that I am anything but eager to do so, for I am more than a little afraid that you may become discouraged, and since our free will is the most fundamental character we possess, it being inseparable from the rational nature, I feel the utmost repugnance to influencing another person except where readiness to inquire, examine, or consider is obvious. However, you should know that in the event of a, quote, mixed marriage, the non-Catholic is obliged to receive a certain minimum of instruction about the Church, and to agree that the children, if any, should be reared as Catholics. In point of fact, most mixed marriages are not too successful. But neither are most marriages, people being what they are. Having been a Protestant most of my life, the idea of marrying one seems much more natural to me than it does to a, quote, cradle Catholic. And obviously the ideal marriage for a convert is with a convert. But lifelong Catholics look with intense repugnance on marriage with Protestants, and this I have discovered somewhat to my surprise. You and I are faced with one of those situations, which fortunately are not very numerous in one lifetime, which cannot possibly be adequately judged beforehand. It strikes me as a colossal gamble, or rather a very great adventure, and personally I am considerably exhilarated by the risks. This exhilaration may compensate for the absence of romance, quote unquote. The greatness of the adventure perhaps consists partly in the fact that as a Catholic I can marry only once, but as with being born, perhaps once is quite sufficient. In the Church, you know, there is a great heightening of every moment of experience, since every moment is played against a supernatural backdrop. Nothing can be humdrum in this scheme. Every least act of the mind has infinite significance. Am I still there? Yes, we're still there. Dostoevsky, by the way, is one of the few novelists who has succeeded in realizing this in art. In the world of pathos, on the other hand, no act has any significance. There are no standards beyond those of immediate sensation. Pathos himself recognizes this and, in consequence, presents the situation not despairingly but satirically. And just as there is nothing good or true which is not Catholic, so there are a great many excellent things which can be had only by the Catholic. Needless to say, however, most Catholics are too lazy or too feeble to use what they possess. And particularly in America, where the main currents of life are profoundly anti-Catholic, the average Catholic is too timid, too overawed by the surrounding splendor to feel able to be anything but an inferior Catholic. As the splendor rapidly becomes ludicrous and stupid, the Church will press forward in America. This is happening even now. We're almost done. You speak quite truly of my lack of worldly ambition. Perhaps this lack in me is simply a lack of competence for such success. But please don't imagine that I despise such competence. I am prepared to do all I can to achieve a reasonable standard of living. My trouble, of course, is that I now enjoy such a high standard of living. Most students can have pleasures which no money can ever command. That I am loath to sacrifice my intellectual standards to achieve a more popular success. The question then arrives, can I reconcile the two things? Is it possible to achieve a success through sheer excellence? Well, I know many who have done so, but many more who are equally excellent do not. And my unyielding, independent temperament is against me here. I simply can't bring myself to curry favor among men who I consider inferior in ability. But I can be utterly congenial with people who I know to be equal or superior, and with inferiors from whom I expect nothing, or on whom I depend for nothing. Really, Corinne, I'm not boasting about this. It is not perhaps entirely creditable to be this way. Nor do I see how the most marvelous possible wife, do you recognize yourself, could do much to alter this. But she could undoubtedly do a very great deal to assist a man along the road to excellence. I am very aggressive, very ardent in anything I do, but I need drive. There are any number of ways in which you could help me, but I hope you know that I would never ask or require it. It is quite obvious, though, that if you were not to help me, but simply expected things to happen by magic, we would fail miserably. So far as money is concerned, I have never been tempted to spend more than I have. My personal expenditures always have and always will be small. Books, perhaps a slight exception here. I have never been able to understand why a man earning a fixed stipend should concern himself about money. My instinct is to turn all of it over to the other partner in the enterprise. This, I have heard, is the traditional European method. It strikes me as utterly natural. Isn't it queer at first glance that in America, of all places, where women are ostensibly the only object of money-making, that men should budget them? It is, of course, merely another evidence that the American male has an essential contempt for, as well as fear of, women. Well, I've arranged my year's leave of absence with Father McCabe, so it's Cambridge now without query. It will be ever so much more satisfactory to have the Ph.D., and besides, it will give me a most refreshing year, and one in which to get a job of scholarship done, or at least on the way to completion. Most of my work is going to be critical, I can see. One must get things into print, you know, in order to command attention and salary. Good teaching goes for nothing in our universities today. Incidentally, don't concern yourself over the, quote, regrettable incident cited in my last letter. There was nothing scandalous about it. Thought you might enjoy one of my freshman's exam papers. I didn't choose the topic and think it a poor one. Their prepared themes are much better than this, naturally. By the way, could you send back the passos as soon as you've done with it? Have to stop this. Do write some more letters like the last one. You are dear to me beyond thinking, Corinne. Yours, Marshall. Well, that's something. I've gone way over, but I'm going to finish this last letter because from 1940, July 16th, Marshall to Mrs. Herbert Marshall McLuhan. I think it's important to have something to cleanse the intensity of that last letter, and this is a very short one. It is written on St. Louis University Department of English letterhead. In the Melbourne, Tuesday, 11 a.m. Dearest, you're special this a.m. while shaving, sort of substitute for orange juice. By the way, without any malice, may I say that Doc's humor, apropos of your getting back into circulation, has some subtleties you aren't alert to? Your letters are never more satisfactory than when you think them dreary and dreadful. More substance in them by far. I'm very curious to see you standing up in 130 pounds, just about the right weight for you, isn't it? You realize that we shall both regret your refusal to finish your discussions with the doc? So be it. Corinne, dearest, I have no image of you to which I expect you to conform. I merely suggest that your own effort to hide behind the images you present to your public are well enough for that public, but not for me. Don't weary of explanation, Corinne, for to explain means to throw light upon, and we need plenty of light. Unwillingness to explain is simply fear of light. You may not believe it, but I am very timid about the poetry of my friends, and 1,000 times more so about yours. As soon as you would really like me to see a poem, do let me see it. I would feel very happy. The two you have sent me were offered in a different spirit, as you explain, and were read as you intended. And so I want to hear from you every day in the hour. Every day on the hour, my dearest wife. Yours, Marshall. Feel lousy about not having sent you money long ago, but have been waiting for an advance on my next check. Don't be sensitive about the wretched stuff as though it an exceedingly deformed relative or else the Holy Ghost. Monday morning. Well, darling, have just pulled out of another tailspin with the help of a few bucks, and thought you might as well have a note with the check. You see, I have an hour and a half gap from 9:30 to 11 a.m. during which I simply sit idly and think of you in the Melbourne Hotel. Shall pick up the check and post this to you during that time. You can imagine how very hard it is going to be for me to keep my mind on anything this week. Shall probably collapse when you arrive, but that won't matter a bit. In fact, it would be a pleasant relief. Have been as tense as wire for so long now. It's been tough for you too, in a very different way, my dearest. Don't ever feel that I'm indifferent to your troubles or that I'm unperceiving. You are the very breath of my life, Corinne, and it is small wonder that after these weeks away from you, I'm a bit puffy. You're quite breathless, Marshall. And that's just an example of the correspondence, a few examples of the correspondence between Marshall and Corinne. It's quite something to get a glimpse into the intense romance, emotional as well as spiritual dimensions of their correspondence. Yeah, and like I said, there's a couple boxes at least, if not more, full of this correspondence to one day organize and document and share and perhaps write a different sort of biography. I think the role of Corinne McLuhan, a Southern belle, in Marshall's life is vastly underestimated. Obviously, Marshall did not place too small an importance on her and leaned on her heavily. It's quite amazing to hear in that letter how much in 1938, 39, he was saying that he didn't really have very much ambition, but, with her help, maybe he could do something. It's quite amazing when you think of what he managed to accomplish. Anyway, the story of their romance is remarkable. He was a northerner, being from Canada, and her family was not impressed, being a well-to-do Fort Worth, Texas family. They basically, essentially eloped. They married against her family's wishes, and I'd really love to read some of the letters from around that time. I've seen one or two, and they're pretty amazing talking about it. So anyway, I've more than made up for last week's short episode with this week. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for supporting the McLuhan Institute. You can find me at patreon.com/McLuhan. ericmcluhan.com/bookshop has lots of things for sale. Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, whatever. Thank you. Good night.